All right. Hello to everybody still making their way in. Good to see everybody. Happy to have you here. I'll go ahead and get started just so we can be cognizant of everybody's time. But yeah, welcome to the second in a continuing series of presentations through DuPage ROSC. We do these once a month, usually on some kind of topic that's kind of crucial or important to what's going on in the recovery continuum out here in DuPage County. So this month, we're getting a presentation on cannabis. So I want to preface this with something. So as a lot of you know, I'm the coordinator for DuPage ROSC, but the lead agency that we do that through is Serenity House in Addison. So we specialize in housing for men and women, sober housing. And so a few years ago, when I first got to Serenity House, and maybe Don or someone else can back me up on this, the majority of the substance use that we were seeing was alcohol and opiates. Those were kind of the two main ones. Obviously other things too, stimulants and things, but those are kind of two of the big ones. But over the past few years, we've started to see more clients come in who their primary drug of choice is cannabis. And to a lot of people, cannabis is still one of those things where it seems like a substance that is not as harmful. Because it's legalized, people look at it as something that's obviously not as serious as some of the chronic use of alcohol and other substances. However, after talking to some of these clients, you realize not only has the type of cannabis changed over the years, but the effect that it's having on people has changed too. And again, especially since it became legalized. So that brings it into a whole nother realm and something we should definitely be having conversations about. So thank you again for being here. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our guest. So John Skocz, listen to this. He's an MA, he's an LCPC, and a CAADC. He's also the coordinator for behavioral health services at Central DuPage Hospital, which is Northwestern Medicine. So I'm happy to have him here and talk to us today. And we will leave some time at the end for some discussion. So I'll kind of keep track of the time on that. So John, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you. Thank you again for making the time for us today.
Thanks, Jared, and thank you for the, I would say, great introduction. Just a couple different points, I think, just for maybe background and also maybe why I selected the topic within all of it. I ended up getting an invite to ROSC back in May, I believe. We had a different program manager at the time, and she was unable to make a meeting, so they asked if I could come to be just a representative there for Central DuPage Hospital. And I gotta tell you, I really loved it. I think it's a fantastic program that you all have set up there. And being able to continue to attend, on one part, we have a new program manager now, and I'm sure she'll be attending and operating in that sense. But regardless, I plan to stay involved as either as part of a ongoing representative to NM or just as a community member. This is a fantastic movement in the right direction that you all have started, and having the opportunity just to do something for it, to give a little bit to it, and to get involved is great for me. And when I saw that Jared had been asking for somebody to volunteer for presentations, I took a jump at it. It's been a while since I've done one, but I wanted to grab a few different topics, and Jared and I were talking on a few email threads about different options. And this was kind of the one that stood out to me. And interestingly, a part of it that stood there is to what Jared talked about, and how more and more people are using cannabis. Cannabis is becoming more of a drug of choice for many users or people suffering in their current states of addiction. But it's also very well, if you will, mixed into one's use when they're using anything else, if it's for any other substance. And it continues to have a waxing and waning period throughout just American history as to whether it's safe, it's medicinal, it's illegal, it's a gateway drug. we may flash back to some of those times when we saw different videos back in the day when they were black and white and talking about reefer madness, if you will. But this is something a little bit different than what used to be there. And even for myself, I've only been in the field since 2009. But when I started working in an outpatient private clinic, and it was for adolescents and young adults. And we worked with all populations, and we accepted all forms of insurance, payment, non-payment, all that. So it was wonderful because we could help anybody. We really didn't have any restrictions. And listening to just the stories in the very beginning when I was just learning and getting connected, just the stories that the clients would talk about, their lives, if you will, the concepts that fall within the biological, psychological, and sociological factors, their home life, school, family, exposure, and what that's going to impact. And a lot of times they came in with those beginning substance use issues, mostly alcohol and cannabis. And since the legalization of cannabis in Illinois in 2020, that might be a good spot too to take a look at it again, just as to what's going on with it. Before I pull up the PowerPoint, I would like to say I did not include more of those traditional things that I guess I'm used to in a lecture about cannabis or anything, which is talking about the DSM-5 criteria, taking a look at all the different brain structures and pieces like that. The reason I excluded it was because we work in the field, so we have an understanding, a basic understanding, if nothing else, just of how it works and impacts, and that we know it challenges our abilities in the short-term use for memory, concentration, coordination, mood, sleep, appetite, and prolonged use over a longer period of time. Well, we know it can lead to addiction. And I'll show some of those factors in this presentation that I hope kind of show what it is and how that's changed, as well as what, if you will, science, recovery community, treatment is doing to try and have a positive impact on it. So I'm going to try and do the screen share here. Hopefully I get this right. And I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint. I have it right here. So let's see. Hey, Jared, quick question.
Yes.
It's only giving me my screen or iPhone, iPad when I'm looking at it.
Okay. Do you want me to just pull it up and you can just let me know when to cycle through?
Yeah, because I don't want to lose anybody's time here.
All right, everybody see that?
Yep.
So the topic we have, of course, is cannabis legalization trends and alternative treatments. And just at the bottom, I did put just my direct contact information. So if you guys have more questions afterwards, if you want any of the references I've made or anything like that, you have all my contact info there at the bottom. Go ahead, Jared. I started with a quote from Dr. Volko, who's the director of the National Institute of Drug Abuse, NIDA, right? But just changes in marijuana policy across states' legalization. Marijuana for medical and or recreational use suggests that marijuana is gaining greater acceptance in our society. Thus, it is particularly important for people to understand what is known about both the adverse health effects and the potential therapeutic benefits linked to marijuana. Next. So I wanted to start with legalization. Go ahead. And what I put in here was kind of a brief timeline. And this is throughout US history. So we can see that in the very beginning, well, it was legal and used medicinally. But as times progressed, in 1914, the Harrison Act was signed, making drug use itself a criminal act. So people who suffered were now criminalized. But it wasn't until 1915 when California was the first one to make possession of cannabis, in this case, directly illegal. By 1930, Federal Bureau of Narcotics was warning of the increasing abuse, and within 7 years, 23 states had outlawed cannabis. And shortly after 1942, cannabis was removed from the U.S. pharmacopoeia, so no longer could it be prescribed or used in a medicinal way, or itself also being removed from having legitimate medical benefits. Cannabis, then in 1956, is listed on the Federal Narcotics Control Act, resulting in strict punishment as a federal offense for cannabis-related possession and use. Continuing, we see that in 1970, it became the Controlled Substance Act listed it as a Schedule I narcotic, absolutely deeming it to have the highest potential for abuse with no medicinal properties or value. No longer did the previous, if you will, going back in time, as we saw, it had nothing of any benefit in their belief. However, only 2 years later, President Nixon at the time created a commission to review the cannabis laws due to the high punishments. And by 1978, Mexico became the first state to allow for medicinal use of cannabis. So the concept of having marijuana back into, well, United States medicine, if you will, has actually been around for quite a long time. And it kind of made me think about some of the other substances that might have had a similar journey, if you will, such as opiates, cocaine, amphetamines. Some of these things you used to be able to back in those days before the 70s, if you will, 50s, 40s. But I mean, you could purchase these things out of, well, the Sears and Roebuck catalog. We may have seen some of those old images on the internet or in our books and such, but these used to be regular prescribed and some marketed in beneficial ways. However, they didn't understand the potential for abuse. Now, those substances rightfully continued on and were, you know, placed into their proper control statuses, and then such as heroin and cocaine becoming Schedule I and having high potential for abuse with no medicinal property because, well, there was other ways to obtain pain medications and pain control, which that's going to be a whole different presentation, I will say. But going back to cannabis, by 1979, though, 11 states decriminalized it. And what was interesting, because it was a good reminder for me, if nothing else, was that if you decriminalize it, it doesn't mean that it's not illegal. It just means you get in less trouble, basically. So you're not getting the severe penalties, but you could still be subject to local civil penalties, tickets and the like, if you will. But you wouldn't be facing jail time in the same sense. And then to a bit of interest here, in 1996, California was then the first state to legalize medicinal cannabis. So taking it from being allowed, if you will, under strict guidelines like New Mexico had, but in 1996, California was the one to attach that legalized wording to it. So 81 years after its first state to criminalize it. Go ahead. So we can see the efforts from 1979 until 2000 to decriminalize cannabis were not very successful. There was some here and there, but it was not as wide sweeping as to what took place in 2012 when Colorado and Washington legalized cannabis. It was after that point that more and more states started to do the same. So as of this year, approximately 19 states, which do include the District of Columbia and 2 of the territories, have legalized cannabis. And 37 states, District of Columbia, and 3 territories have now permitted for medicinal use. So quite a big change, considering its journey and beginning, but also within 10 years. However, as we know, just because it might be legal in the state doesn't mean it's federally permitted. So that does place people who use cannabis or have cannabis, if they go to certain locations or buildings and things like that, the laws are different and they're subject to, well, punishments, whereas they were not in those buildings or those situations, they would not be. So it is a big piece to remember when we look at what cannabis is. It's still federally not approved, still legal, but the states have chosen to change their approach on it. All right, go ahead. So let's take a look at our state. And here's where Illinois fell in the timeline that we saw before over the entire US. So in 1931, recreational use became prohibited. And then in 1978, it became illegal via the Cannabis Control Act. This also has some of the attachment to the war on drugs, if you will. And we're going to see how this Cannabis Control Act actually will be playing a role in what happened in 2020. By 2013, Illinois had moved to permitting medicinal cannabis. 2016, we decriminalized it. But they still had some restrictions in terms of if you had X amount, now it would be criminal, right? And by that, they just had a lot stiffer penalties. If you had so much without the right permits, basically, if you didn't have your medical card, if you will, you didn't get the same liberties of just having it with you or growing as someone who does have a medicinal approval. Now in 2017, we can see it didn't take too long. So from 2013, 2017, we went from medicinal to the first proposal for recreational. And as that proposal was there, they moved in 2018 to expand the trial for medical cannabis. So allowing ease of access for patients. They could, more ailments, more symptoms, more diagnoses qualify. The amount that a person could have with them or grow in their home had also increased. And then by 2019, it was signed, the expansion and the things they granted was signed into law, making it a permanent program. So it wasn't something that then could just expire over time and be, well, forgotten about. And then brings us to January 2020. And cannabis, if you will, was legalized under this House Bill Act 1438, the Cannabis Regulation and Tax Act of January 1st, 2020. Go ahead. So what did the bill do? I pulled in some parts from a summary that I had located because there's a lot more that it does, and it was interesting here because I can tell you when I first knew of its legalization, if you will, it was more of the things I could read online, things that would show up in the newspaper that would really talk more about what's going to happen next with it. And one of the things that was impactful here for just myself and working here at Central DuPage was we enacted a policy not permitting any use of cannabis while a person is a patient at VHS. And we also don't permit any use of CBD products. And the reason being is they're not technically pure, and you can have THC components in there, which can result in toxicology screens that can become questionable, and sometimes for some even positive when they're not actually using the THC based version, the Delta 9 version. That's the psychoactive substance. So with that, it's been helpful to make a nice clear understanding for the patient that's come through our treatment. So with that change, it didn't change much to how here I would provide care for my patients, but it would bring up the discussions of, well, what do I do afterwards? Is it addictive? What happens if I was to use it? What if I use a little bit? All those questions that I can say I hadn't heard in years, because most people had just accepted, if you will, well, it's illegal, I can't do it, I'm not going to do it. If I were to use it in treatment, I'm definitely going to get in trouble. But now it got legalized. And here, as we call them, my patients would now have questions about it, whereas they would not necessarily ask those direct questions of cannabis before. And what I noticed, at least in my own thinking, was it seemed to align with some of the connections people would make about using alcohol, or the, if you will, across addiction and or harm reduction. If they're using different substances such as cocaine or prescription medications or opiate-based things, when they would inquire about, well, could I just have a drink? So I found that cannabis started to fall into that same kind of category. And I think in this bill, we'll see that that is how it was presented, and then how this presentation and legalization, well, changed what is out there in our world. So adults who are 21 and older can possess 30 grams of a flower, 5 grams of concentrate, and no more than 500 milligrams of THC infused product. So another change was that medical patients may possess more than 30 grams, and they can also grow several of their own plants as long as it's at their private residence and secured. One of the things that did stay the same to the benefit of patients who use it medicinally is their sales tax remained at 1%. Some of the sales taxes that the shops charge can be upwards of 30% of the product cost. So the other thing that this bill did was to create the Cannabis Regulation Fund to properly allocate the tax revenue. And I would imagine that they're going to hopefully keep a good eye on this tax revenue that comes in, because they do have an interesting plan for it. But you'll notice it looks like it's going to generate quite a lot of money for the state of Illinois, and rapidly. Beginning, they said at 2020 when it first rolled out, 57 million, but in 2 years from now, it could be as high as $375.5 million a year in tax revenue. That's very big in my mind. I'm sure there's things that produce higher tax revenue, but to me, that's a lot of money. Next slide. So what are they going to do with it? Well, 35% of it goes to the general revenue fund, which is, if you will, the general coffers for the state of Illinois. Now 25% of it, and overall, if I remember my calculation correct, 45% of the total tax revenue will be used for the state. The remaining money will then be used for these different programs that are supposed to help fund. And the first one here, 25%, is called the Restore, Reinvest, and Renew Program, or R3. Now, the program was created to address problems specifically caused by the overuse of criminal justice system, or a war on drugs in the R3 areas, as it mentioned in the summation. Now, the R3 areas, well, they're determined, well, by civic leaders, communities, statistics, and things like that. So they will set what these areas are, but it's pretty much areas, if you will, that have high crime rates, high unemployment, poor access to resources, and also have shown the decimation of, substance use in the areas that have resulted in crime and perhaps other, kind of unequal and social justice matters that should be addressed. So it sounds like a nice place to put the money, I think. Definitely helping with some of these things. However, how will they be finding it? Well, again, it's through the Lieutenant Governor's Justice, Equality, and Opportunity Initiative. and the Illinois Criminal Information Authority. And what they will do also for these R3 areas is they're going to allow for people who are looking to place the shops in those areas to have a expedited licensure applications, and they have a point ranking system, if you will, for the applicants. So the more areas that they check off that show that they're going to be placing it perhaps in one of the R3 areas, that the person applying for the licensure has, if you will, disadvantages of any sort, whatever those could be, all the way to their plans to maybe do things for the community. So the more a person demonstrates that it's going to have a benefit, well, they will get their licenses quicker. Another interesting fact for this is they're going to have about 8 community colleges that they wanted to get licensed in the first couple of years here. And this license would allow for a vocational pilot program. And the program is to teach the students about cannabis, cannabis business, and, if you will, the other intricacies of growing, cultivating, and those factors. And they'll be awarded a certificate in the end of this schooling's career in cannabis certificate. And I have to say, when I first saw that, because I had never seen that before, I didn't know that was a part of it. It did make me wonder. I don't think they've really had anything else ever out there of a similar nature, if you will. I'm thinking about alcohol. I know that they have. You can go to the brewing clubs and all these different clubs and stuff, and you can learn independently if you want through these businesses, but nothing that was supported through, well, formal education, to my knowledge. Something else that this act allowed for was for people who had minor criminal convictions related to cannabis, depending on their qualifications, and they can apply for their cannabis-based charges to be expunged. They can get pardons, and they can even have convictions vacated. And that's all from, as you can see there, the Cannabis Control Act of 1978. So it's offering relief to people who had, let's say, on a hypothetical felony charge for cannabis, who couldn't get a job in a field they wanted to, or even just get a job because they have felony cannabis convictions. Those can be taken away. And now they have, well, the same opportunities. However, if the cannabis crime was committed in connection to any sort of violent criminal act, and those are things involving weapons, domestic violence, stalking, things that have violence connected, and or any sexual crime as well, they're not eligible. So they cannot have their cannabis crimes or charges expunged, pardoned, or vacated. Next. All right. Where's the rest of the money going to go? Well, 10% is going to go to the Budget Stabilization Fund, and that's to pay, well, our state's unpaid bills. And then 8% gets to go to the local government distributive fund to support aspects of the legal system in order to address illegal cannabis market and cannabis-based DUIs. So for prosecution of those who are now engaging in unregulated cannabis sales, if you will, and or those who are found to be under the influence while operating any sort of vehicle or item. But, if you will, 20%, or total of 22%, gets to go to substance abuse and prevention and mental health concerns, along with supporting data collection and analysis of that data to understand what is the impact on public health from legalizing cannabis. So I don't remember what the next slide is, but I think we're going to move right into that one next. Jared? All right. So a few other things that came along with it, just to point on their marketing. And well, from looking at different websites and such, it holds pretty true. They cannot have any images of cannabis leaves, persons using and or overusing cannabis products. They cannot promote in direct language the health benefits of cannabis. They can make other statements, but nothing that would be supported or legitimatized. They can't have any images or items that could be appealing to minors or persons under the age of 21. I can say that that's a thin line from what different things I've looked at and a few of the things we'll get into later. And then, of course, they're not supposed to do any promotional giveaways or competitions with cannabis as a prize. And last 2 points about the product packaging. So, according to the Act, they have to have these statements on there that it contains cannabis, it's intended for adults 21 and older, and that it can impair your cognition. It may be habit forming, should not be used by pregnant or breastfeeding women. It's unlawful to sell or provide this item to an individual, and it may not be transported outside the state of Illinois. It is illegal to operate a motor vehicle while under the influence of cannabis. Possession or use of this product may carry significant legal penalties in some jurisdictions and under federal law. So again, there's that piece. It's okay in Illinois and it's okay in many other states, but it's still not okay. So child resistant packaging must also be there, and it has to comply with the Safety Commission standards for the Poison Prevention Act. Let's see how that's impacted us as well. All right, next. So let's take a look at the trends, and I kind of broke these down in a few different ways to see what has really been showing up. So next. All right. So here's what we kind of know about it so far. As of 2019, 48.2 million people, 12 or older, reported using cannabis. It wasn't broken down into these are the people who are using daily, who are using weekly, but they just said that 48.2 million people, age 12 and over, have used cannabis in 2019. It's also the third most popular substance behind nicotine and alcohol, respectively. It had been a while since I remembered, but it was interesting to see that there are over 100 chemicals within the cannabis plant. But the ones that get the most attention, of course, are the tetrahydrocannabinol, sorry, it's a mouthful for me, or it's also known as Delta-9. And it is the psychoactive chemical that results in our impairment. Now there's Delta-8, and I didn't include it in here because it's a derivative, but it's a synthetic manufactured form of THC, if you will. And it actually uses rather harsh chemicals to synthesize the Delta-8 THC. For example, butane is used a lot in it. And thinking about other harmful substances that are out there, butane is used as a very much a powerful chemical in the creation of many other substances and has very harmful effects. Now CBD, or cannabidiol, that does not have the psychoactive impairment. But most of the stuff that is out there about cannabis, well, they focus on, well, THC, the Delta-9. So part of the history piece with cannabis and its medicinal that I brought over here is that there was a hope that medicinal cannabis would have some sort of positive factor in reducing opiate prescribing, the treatment of opiate disorders, perhaps in a harm reduction method or in managing some of opiate-based withdrawals, and a overall goal of reducing the opioid overdose death rate. It had no such effect. So medicinal cannabis has no positive impact, well, on opiate use. Medicinal cannabis is permitted for many medical symptoms, however, but not for treating and managing substance abuse withdrawal. Medicinal cannabis is not prescribed by medical providers. So sometimes that language can get intermixed in daily conversation, sometimes with even those who are seeking treatment. Well, I have a prescription for cannabis. Why can't I take my medicine? Well, it's not technically prescribed because it doesn't have an FDA approval, right? You can't go to the pharmacy to pick it up. You have to get your referral or reference, right? You get the approvals needed so you can possess and use medicinally without the criminal and civil penalties, but it's not in the same manner as a prescriptive medication. All right, next slide. So what else do we know? Well, medicines do exist that mimic the benefits of THC. So the FDA has approved and a couple medications, and these are available by prescription. However, there's many things that you have to have very severe diagnoses for. So there is the Epidiolex, a purified CBD. So it's supposed to be non-impairing, of course, because it's CBD. And with the purified, it leads me to assume that there wouldn't be any THC or Delta-9 in it that one would have to worry about with a toxicology screen, if you will. But it's used to treat severe forms of epilepsy, and you can see the two different syndromes that it listed, as well as a type of a sclerosis complex, tuberous. I don't know what those symptoms are or what those kind of diagnoses are, but seeing that it's severe epilepsy and another one there, these look like very impairing physical health concerns. Now, another one, Dorbinol, or I like using some of their brand names because it's Marinol, or Syndrose. And then there's Naboline or Sesmet. They're synthetic THC. They're lab created, but they're supposed to activate the cannabinoid receptors in our brain and peripheral systems. And that's what is supposed to help reduce our symptoms associated to cancer and AIDS. So the peripheral pieces are within our immune system, organs, muscles, lymph nodes and stuff like that. And then the other, those are CB2 receptors in the peripheral, but CB1 is the one that's in our brain, and that's the one that does, well, all the other intoxicating effects, if you will. But just to give you this difference. And then something else that was thought interesting, and it makes sense to their packaging too, but THC can be passed from mother to the fetus when in utero, and it can also be passed through breastfeeding. So what I found was in 2002, only about 3% of pregnant women reported using cannabis during the pregnancy, but it increased to 5.4% in 2019. And it doesn't seem like a significant amount, because you could say, well, that's 97% who don't and about 94% who don't. But what we forget in that is that still has a detrimental impact to, well, the baby, right? The fetus too, in its full neural pathway development. You know, in some ways that other substances do as well. But THC impacts, well, very specific regions of the brain. So let's go to our next slide. So other things we know about it. Well, it does have well-researched and known adverse health effects and risks to chronic users. So By chronic user, I mean a daily user with, continued use for, well, ongoing years, if you will. So here's what they find. Well, our brain has impaired development of the neural pathways for learning, concentration, and memory. But yet the younger you are, so the youth who begin to use are the ones that have the bigger detriment occur. People who begin using cannabis later on, and by that they kind of separated about age 18. However, I'm curious, and I didn't find or look yet, but when they say the brain doesn't really mature until about age 25 to 27, what's the impact between 18 to 27, if you will? Next up, we see that mental health symptoms, well, they're increased symptoms associated with anxiety, depression, and psychotic disorders. So if we are co-occurring, our cannabis use actually has, well, an adverse impact on these and make our symptoms worse over time. Whereas in the beginning, someone would say, well, I'm feeling better. This is helping me manage my mania. I don't feel as anxious or concerned, or I'm not as sad. I feel a bit more euphoric. But over time, it doesn't work anymore, as we know, right? We develop tolerance, we have progression that begins to happen, and the decimation that occurs to our neurochemistry as well, because our minds can no longer fire those transmissions as they should, because we were doing it artificially. And then for those who smoke, heart and lung tissue damage is the main impact there. So other ways that they've kind of looked to see what has been happening with cannabis is in 2012, there was a study published about a cohort of about 1,000 children that they followed from 1985 to 2012, just to understand, well, what's cannabis doing on neuropsychology? And what they found was, for those children who began to use in adolescence, and they persisted into adulthood, with daily use in adulthood. So what they found was, on average, they lost about 6 IQ points compared to others in their cohort. And of course, we know that frequent use, ongoing use, untreated use also impacts things around us. It's our schools, it's our family systems, it's motivation, it's energy, it's sleep. And we know how important sleep is, because without proper sleep, well, we don't really function at all for the day. Right, next. So, a few other trending information on what we know about cannabis. Well, it can result in addiction for some users, known as a cannabis use disorder. And for us who work in the field, we know that. We've seen that. We have the DSM-5 and now the DSM-5 text revised. We have the ICD-10. We have those things out there. But most people don't get this on a regular basis. They don't get that much information. Maybe at best they got DARE way back in the day when they were in school. But do you remember that? I don't. I just remember that I got it. That's all I remember about it. And what they find is, for those people who are diagnosed with a cannabis use disorder, only 8% on average maintain abstinence. So it's a high relapse rate. And perhaps that prevalence of cannabis in society is an impact factor to it, right? But we'll see. So a person's diagnosed with other substance use disorders, and they didn't directly break down which substance had which range, but they did say about, on average, about 18% were able to maintain an abstinence. But there was a nice range, I thought, of 20 to 50% overall. So within that, it shows good outcomes, but interesting outcomes for those with cannabis use disorder. They struggle more to maintain their abstinence than others. Next slide. So what do we know about the recreational cannabis industry? Well, they spend quite a lot of money to go down and lobby for their industry. You can see it doubled just in 1 year, if you will. And with that, the THC concentration that you could pick up in your local shop, just for the flower, if you will, went from 9% to now over 30%. I haven't seen any, haven't found any yet that's at 40% for flower. But if you go for the concentrated versions, the dabs, the wax, glass shatter, e-liquids, and now live resin, it can be as high as 90% THC. I remember once, way back, that I was told that, THC back in the, 60s and 70s, the concentration that one would find in the flower, that it's maybe 3 to 5%. To think now that it's over 30 is shocking a little bit, which I think that's probably why, if you will, it has become more and more diagnosed, more problematic, if you will. And we can see too that they're making it in such ways that would kind of lend its point to that, as we know, higher alcohol content, different purities of other substances. So we can see that the way it's available is having an impact as well. Next slide. Now, outside of the concentrates and flowers, you can also purchase it in many, many other formats. Most common and available options now are vape pods, vape pens, vape juice, e-liquids, and there's even particular brands such as Juul, who would sell vapable items for nicotine, also has crossed into the cannabis market. You can also find THC-infused syrups, lotions, pills, personal lubricants, and personal inhalers. The items look very much like you would find any other day-to-day purchase, except they will have some sort of designation on it to be different, so that one should hopefully tell the difference. But that's kind of the problem, is that some of the things really look like your day-to-day stuff, such as the edibles, the candies, the gummies, and the chocolates. And that is the big money maker so far, with a $2.2 billion industry as of this year. And it's marketed to consumers in a variety of activities and feelings. So we can engage in activities in a way. We can use our THC as they're promoting this to ease our mind, get relief, to help us hang out with our friends, stimulate our mind and get active and get some sleep. It reminds me of a lot of the alcohol marketing that exists, right? It can help change our moods, give us a blissful, relaxed, creative, pain-free, energetic, sleepy, and hungry mood states. It can be ordered online with home delivery or in-store pickup. Instructions are available to advise new users. I can't say I've seen the same, but it's interesting that they have instructions of how to use it. So brings me to the next point, cannabis and youth. So within that, persons who began abusing cannabis before age 18 are 30% more likely to develop a cannabis use disorder. And to a similar note, a different study found that they have a rate of 4 to 7 times more likely to be diagnosed. As a 2019 survey found that 40% of high school students reported use of cannabis. And there's a couple different monitoring groups, data groups, government-based pieces that help kind of keep an eye on this. So one of them is called Monitoring the Future, and in their 2021 report, they indicated the following regarding use. About 7% of 8th graders, 17% of 10th graders, and about 30% of 12th graders. What was interesting was the pandemic did reduce cannabis use overall with adolescents. However, it gave support to the concept that simply limiting access, I'm sorry, I should say, will not prevent use. I have a typo there. So they did go down, but not in a dramatic way, as one would think. Well, they're stuck in their house and they can't get it. They across the board had about a 5% decrease, which was it. Next slide. However, young adults were found to have this kind of rate. So in 2020, that same report, Monitoring the Future, indicated that college age and college enrolled persons reported historic levels of cannabis use at 44% of those surveyed. It was the highest in 35 years. 11% of them reported using daily as of last year. And in 2020, the report also noted 43% of college aged, but not college enrolled, young adults reported cannabis use and 13% used daily. So age group is a big market, and daily use is prevalent. All right, next. Now, what about the public health? Well, that's one of their concepts of concern, of course. Well, the edibles are the most common form of THC that results in a medical event. Why? Well, because they kind of look like all those other things. They're visually appealing to children, as often mistaken for candy, particularly the gummies. Every once in a while, there'll be a news report that pops up in the Tribune or on any of your social medias about a child, under the age of 18, really not in high school, typically lower elementary, if you will, that somehow has gained access to the parents' THC infused gummies, and they get sick and they have to go to the emergency room. Other factors to know is that for adults, sometimes they'll take too much because the edibles take longer to become effective. So they may believe it's not enough and they'll overconsume. As we can see, it can take up to 2 hours. As well as people will use the cannabis products along with alcohol and or prescribed medications, also resulting in adverse events. Next slide. So symptoms of THC poisoning, if you will: anxiety, tremor, dizziness, confusion, vomiting, hallucinations, and loss of consciousness. And to show kind of just the different impact areas, as we can see, and thinking back to our timeline, as cannabis became more and more prevalent in community for access, the numbers went up and down a little bit, but you still have 10 to 20% from 2006 to 2018 of people ending up in the emergency room. One part more women than men, but overall mostly young adults and children. Next slide. So a few things about the future considerations and what is being planned to address cannabis. Next slide. All right, so ongoing support for research on prevention, education, and treatment through some of these agencies. So Monitoring the Future is a collaboration. Their website, you can even see all their different reports, but they take a look at these different cohorts of a large sample of children over time. That impacts not only substance use, but mental health, biopsychosocial matters. The Adolescent Brain Cognitive Development, the ABCD study, functions in a similar way, except they have more of a focus, of course, on cognitive development, of course. And we still have NIDA and we still have SAMHSA. Medication-assisted therapy that's being studied, gabapentin and BoostBar are being looked at to see if there's a benefit in reducing craving and withdrawal symptoms. There's a supplement they're looking at there, and there's also a type of inhibitor which is supposed to help stop or slow down the breakdown of cannabinoids in the person's system, thus slowing withdrawal symptoms. And then also a cannabinoid antagonist. Therapeutic approaches have not dramatically changed. It's CBT was one of them, motivational enhancement therapy, and contingency management. So nothing dramatically new. Next slide. And I do believe this will be the last slide, which is good for timing too. So on September 30th of this year, President Biden made October the National Youth Substance Use Prevention Month. A couple points from it. So, quick quote: preventing substance use during adolescence has been shown to significantly reduce the chance of developing a substance use disorder later in life. $3.1 billion has been directed to the National Drug Control Funding. This will allow for mental health care, after-school programs, tutoring, program development to prevent and treat youth substance use in local communities and ways that those communities would know best for their resources, access, and cultures. They say for every dollar spent today saves $18 in the future that would have been spent on addressing a problem that came from substance use. Also noting for a positive generational impact by reducing the likelihood of the current youth having substance using children in their future. And to close with the building a healthier and more supportive nation where all young people can reach their full potential and achieve their dreams. As he said, I will never quit fighting to get everyone the support and resources they need to beat this crisis. No one is ever alone. I think the last slide is just questions. Yep.
All right, well, first of all, I just want to thank John for the presentation. There was a ton of really interesting and important stuff in there. And I think as somebody who works in the field, I'm able to take a lot of that away. And I'm someone who wears a couple different hats, right? So my lead agency, we're an abstinence-based program. However, for the programs that we're looking to run through things like DuPage ROSC, we have to be open-minded to multiple pathways to recovery, right? So we have to be able to stay open-minded as far as what people are doing to stay sober, to get off other substances. So I think there's a lot of good stuff to digest and a lot of good conversations to be had. So I'm gonna open it up to the floor. If anybody would like to bring up any other questions or maybe comments about what we heard, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself. And not all at once, please.
I'll just say thank you for giving this presentation. I've been learning a lot about this topic in school, and I've been writing papers on it and doing a lot of research. So this was very beneficial for me. So I really appreciate it. A lot of things, it was like, okay, I already kind of knew this based on like research that I've done for school. And I'm just like, that's pretty cool to have it like all connect and see like the same information like being shared in a presentation like this, as well as like what I'm learning in school and presenting in school. So thank you.
So I appreciate it.
I have a question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
So there was a slide that said that there is no proof that it does help ease any kind of opiate withdrawal, or there's been studies for that, right? That it does not actually, is not proven to help any opiate withdrawal or symptoms. But yet there are rehabs in like California that use that. But so that just puts that to rest, that should not be recommended by any professional because there's no scientific proof or data that it actually helps.
Yeah, it wasn't statistically significant. So to that, some people may have a benefit from it, but it wasn't enough to say that this is a good substance to use to help with it. Whereas you have Suboxone, you have its derivative cousins, if you will. You have later on, you have I don't know why my naltrexone. My mind's going blank while here. But those would be, as one would say, statistically significant and proven to have a benefit across the board.
Thank you.
Anybody else have anything? All right. Well, John, I want to thank you again for taking the time. That was a great presentation. This is a monthly thing. So next month, we actually have one of my colleagues, Danny, who's on the call here, but he's going to be presenting on family and the importance of family in the recovery process. So we'll look forward to that. I will be sending out a follow-up email with the recording, because we are going to put this up on our YouTube page. So if you want to share it with somebody that missed it, and then we'll have information too about the next presentation meeting in November. So thank you again, John, and thanks to everybody for coming today, and we'll see everyone soon.
Thank you all. And if you have anything further, any questions, anything you'd like to talk about for this, let me know and reach out to me. Appreciate it. Thanks again, Jared, for the opportunity.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thanks.
Thanks, John.
Welcome. Bye.